It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you today, and I want to thank all of you for joining us, especially given everything that's going on in our world. While both the Center for the Middle East and North Africa and the Center for South Asian Studies are young centers, this youth has proven to be a source of tremendous energy and activity. While our center was established only in 2019, already there are more than 20 faculty members affiliated with the center, as well as a diverse community of graduate and undergraduate students whose research and engagement reflect the richness and diversity of the Middle East and North Africa. I want to begin today by acknowledging that UC Santa Cruz is built on the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and also to heal from historical trauma. In this same vein, I would like to both recognize and reject formations of settler colonialism that are specific to the Middle East and ongoing, specifically in Israel-Palestine. In this moment, attention has rested on evictions of Palestinians from their Jerusalem homes, attacks on worshipers praying during the holy month of Ramadan, and on Palestinian citizens of Israel more broadly. And finally, on Israeli airstrikes that targeted civilian populations who had no means of escape. We condemn these manifestations of ongoing settler colonialism while also emphasizing that their violence is not, or not only an event, but a structure and thus ongoing and continuous. And I really want to emphasize the ongoing and continuous nature of violence in the face of a ceasefire that does not represent its end. Our event today, Jagged Environments, features Amita Baviskar and Gökçe Günel, and this is the second event that CMINA and the Center for South Asian Studies have co-sponsored this year on the theme of migrant futures. Today's event is rooted in a critical conceptualization of the environmental humanities. Environmental studies are too often narrowly focused on fantasies of the natural, and our event today rejects that approach, instead conceptualizing a material environment that is made by and situated within structures of political economy, questions of global inequality, and also the entanglements of human bodies with one another and with the material world. So with that, I'll say a few words about the structure of today's event. In just a moment, I'm going to hand the floor to my comrade and partner in arms, Anjali Arundikar, who will talk for a few minutes about the Center for South Asian Studies and introduce our first guest. I would ask you to hold your questions and your points of discussion until both speakers have spoken. And at the very end, we'll organize a discussion session and a time to ask questions. During this period of the event, you can raise your hand through the reactions window in order to ask a question. You can also message me directly in the chat with your question. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Anjali.
Thank you, Jennifer, and Jai Bhim to all, and mostly thank you to Jennifer for that rousing and inspiring introduction. We are delighted here at the Center for South Asian Studies to be collaborating with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies in North Africa because our collectivities are joined in more ways than one. The Center for South Asian Studies, as some of you who have been to our events know, is a relatively new center, but very vibrant, and focused explicitly on questions of justice, broadly defined, economic, feminist, environmental, social, and so much more within South Asia and the Indian Ocean world. So today, for us to stand in solidarity with our Palestinian kin is to precisely embrace the mission of justice that we have set forth for ourselves. To work in South Asia today and in other regions of the world in the global South is to foreground and simultaneously resist histories of occupation, authoritarianism, as we see in Indian occupied Kashmir, and the foundational disposability of minoritized bodies, as we have seen all over the media and everywhere else in the pandemic in India, marked by questions of caste, religion, gender, and labor segmentation. To refuse the authority of the apartheid state that is Israel is to embark on the same journey. To refuse Hindutva is to refuse Zionism. To speak of Azad Kashmir is to speak of free Palestine. At the heart of our struggles remains the enduring question of environment, sustainability, infrastructure, and the subaltern life worlds within which our collectivities survive, resist, refuse, and sometimes even surrender. Our collaboration today signals just one engagement to stage much needed South-South conversations on these pressing issues. So it is my greatest pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, my dear friend and longtime comrade, Dr. Amita Baviskar, who is a professor of environmental studies and sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University, and whose work in the cultural politics of environment and development in rural and urban India and the role of social inequality and identities in natural resource conflicts remains, in my mind, unparalleled and foundational to not just those of us who work in South Asia, but beyond. She focuses on too many questions for me to narrate, but her first book, for example, In the Belly of the River, Tribal Conflicts Over Development in the Narmada Valley, has now become essential reading for anyone interested in resource rights, popular resistance. And I remember my own excitement and enthusiasm when I encountered the book for the first time. She has, again, too many publications to list, but I will list her three more recent ones. One is a collaboration with another dear friend, Professor Raka Ray, which is called Elite and Everman, the Cultural Politics of the Indian Middle Class, and another two books, First Garden of the Republic, Nature on the President's Estate, and a more recent book in 2020, the much needed Uncivil Society, Ecology, Equity, and the Commons in Delhi. Currently, she's working on the politics of food and changing agrarian environments in Madhya Pradesh and studying the social experience of air pollution in Delhi. I think she will be sharing with us today some of that new work. So please join me in welcoming on this very bizarre Zoom platform, Amita, who has stayed up till the wee hours to share her wisdom and gyan with us. So Amita, take it away.
Thank you so much, Anjali. Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm struggling not so much with the the fact that it's midnight in Delhi, because I'm a night bird actually, but with the fact that things have been just really dreadful, as most of you probably know, over the last few weeks. And so it's in that context that I'm speaking today. And I'm going to therefore get into the question of migrant futures by talking about the situation around me, which is that of the pandemic. And just to refresh your memory, I should mention that for us, the pandemic has been associated with a series of lockdowns. The first one started last year in March. Abruptly, within 4 hours, the government announced there would be a 21-day total lockdown, followed by another 19 days going into May. And during that total lockdown, 40 days long, people were completely banned from stepping out of their homes except to buy essential supplies. All places of work, private and public offices, with the exception of essential services like hospitals or pharmacies and grocery stores. But all shops and factories, schools and colleges, restaurants and theaters were closed. Public transport was stopped and private vehicles weren't allowed to run either. And the government announced that all employers should pay full wages to all workers during the period of the lockdown. That was last year, over March, April, May. And after that, things eased up for about 4 months. Then we got our first wave, so-called, of infections, of distress and deaths in October, November, in the cities mainly. Following that, there was a lull, there was a kind of a breather over the winter months. And since then, there's been a catastrophic rise from early April this year, which shows no signs of abating. We're told 26 million cases, 300,000 people dead. But the numbers are only minimums, I think, because this is happening, these estimates are coming out in a country where even in the usual course of events, the vast majority of illness and death goes unrecorded. So we are again in a lockdown, and every day in the last 3 weeks has brought news of someone I know dying. Almost every family I know has suffered and is still struggling with illness and its lingering aftermath. So I'm going to try and talk about what this last year and more has meant, and the way in which it has shone a spotlight on migrants, on their past, present, and future. And I'm going to do it in 3 stages in a way. First, drawing upon the work that I did for my book, Uncivil City, moving from that urban context to the rural, and then ending by talking a little bit about what these experiences bring up for us as questions, as researchers, as well as scholars. And if there's one thing that the pandemic and the lockdown have brought into focus, it's the predicament of migrant workers as people without place. Deprived of productive resources, denied state welfare, migrants, I now recognize, inhabit an in-between world where crafting livelihoods and dignity and security is a perpetual struggle. And I'm going to talk about the challenges posed by ecological and economic precarity in urban and rural India, and argue that long-standing categories of analysis that we've taken for granted, the city as well as the countryside, the idea of the refugee and the migrant as separate categories of people, these ideas fail to contain and explain the landscapes that people traverse and transform. And that for ecological and social justice, we need conceptual grounds that do justice to the constancy of impermanence. Let me begin by a group that I know from close to home and also from their places of where they live in the city. I'm going to begin by talking about domestic workers. Nelson, may I have the first slide, please? And I'm going to enter the world of migrant workers by talking about women and girls who make up the ranks of domestic workers, essential to the smooth running of the middle and upper class Indian household. Most of them come from rural areas, they belong to low income, low caste groups, and they've moved to cities and towns in search of a better life. And what happened to them during the lockdown is what I shall spend some time talking about. So although the government had urged employers to pay workers during this period, only a tiny proportion of domestic workers received full wages. Next slide, please. The majority were told by their employers, and the next, that since they hadn't worked, they wouldn't be paid or would be given only a part of their salary. And some employees justified holding back their pay by saying that their own earnings had declined due to the lockdown and they had to tighten their belts. Others said that they paid their workers in order to ensure that a good worker, someone who is diligent and familiar with the household's way of doing things, would feel obliged to return. Whether they paid grudgingly or gladly, employers acted as if they were doing their I'm sorry, is my mic on?
Yes, Amita, you're good.
Okay, thanks for that. So whether they paid gladly or grudgingly, most employers acted as if they were doing workers a favor and expected them to be grateful. So domestic workers couldn't demand wages as a right. Next slide, please. They had to beg and cajole. A woman who worked for an affluent household for 20 years reported that when she indignantly said, "But main bheek to nahi mang rahi. I'm not asking you for alms. I'm asking you for what's due to me," her employer sacked her, saying, "I don't like your attitude. You can't speak to me in this way." So the lockdown has brought to the surface this deep-seated tension inherent in the relationship between of class dominance and mutual dependence. When it eased up, dependence battled against suspicion, while middle-class women who still bear the responsibility of doing almost all chores around the house were desperate to hand over jobs to domestic workers again. Several resident welfare associations or the neighborhood organizations of property owners, fearful about the spread of infection, continued to maintain a strict quarantine. And this set off furious debates within gated communities between men and women because women residents were keen to have domestic workers resume their duties. But the male dominated RWA executives held out for postponing their entry as long as possible. When workers were finally let in, they were subjected to new forms of segregation in some gated communities, and such as being prohibited from using elevators and forced to use stairs. Next slide, please. Remarkably, domestic workers were characterized as the carriers of contagion, a threat to domestic middle class homes, even though throughout this period, the virus was being transmitted almost entirely by well to do Indians who had traveled abroad. Now, for domestic workers who this announcement of the lockdown and the sudden suspension of employment was a shock. Many of them could not collect the back pay that they were owed, and many experienced an immediate crisis in making ends meet. Working women's paid work in middle-class households stabilized the income of their own households. Women's salaries were often more reliable than the irregular jobs that men found. Next slide, please. On construction sites, peddling rickshaws, and small trades and street vending. With women and men out of work, next slide, even feeding the family soon became a challenge with daily provisions and cooking fuel going out of reach. Next slide. While the cost of rent, school fees, electricity, medical bills, and all everyday essentials became impossible to bear. So in working class settlements, densely packed shanty towns, next, where residents shared water sources and toilets, where physical distancing is impossible, fear of getting infected fused with the fear of starvation. Within the first weeks of lockdown, almost all the bastis or working class neighborhoods emptied out as those who were renting places to live decided to head home to the villages that they came from. Next slide. This then was the appalling tragedy that unfolded. Millions of migrant workers thrown out of jobs, their savings fast dwindling, trying to get to a place of safety, but hamstrung by the shutting down of buses and trains and by the closure of state borders. Next slide. Hundreds of thousands of desperate people decided to walk home, trudging thousands of kilometers in killing heat, pulling along and carrying their children, their possessions bundled on their heads. Next slide. Their mouths parched and their bellies empty, aching bodies and blistering feet. This was the biggest exodus that India had seen since the partition of the country in 1947. More than 300 died along the way, killed in road and traffic accidents, and many collapsed from dehydration, hunger, and exhaustion, heart attacks, and quite likely the virus. Next slide, please. And what was this home to which they were returning? Next slide. To understand this, one must know something about rural India. Next slide. A little more than 47%, or almost half of all Indians, still depend on agriculture. Yet, 1.14 million rural Indian households, or 56%, have no agricultural land. Of those who do, 85% own small and marginal farms, each with less than 5 acres of land. Water, nutrients, credit, and other resources are in short supply. Next slide, please. A precarious agrarian economy and the absence of basic amenities in rural areas forces more and more Indians to move to cities and towns and to areas of capital-intensive agriculture. Next slide. Traveling vast distances across states in search of remunerative work. Almost all work in this so-called informal economy, a term that encompasses diverse occupations and work arrangements under which 93% of India's workforce labors. Next slide. What binds these people together is their vulnerability, the absence of job security, decent wages, healthcare, and other occupational safeguards, and the denial of state welfare. So these workers walk a precarious tightrope. They balance low-paid jobs and trades in the city with seasonal agricultural work in the countryside. Next slide. We must remember that the Indian economy marches to the beat of the monsoons. When urban construction work stops during the rainy season, workers return to their villages to help with the labor-intensive tasks of plowing and sowing and weeding. Next slide. The lockdown has caused this tightrope between the city and the village to suddenly slacken so that migrant workers tumbled into a free fall. No safety net of state support, such as unemployment benefits, protected them in their urban workplaces. Their modest savings were soon eaten into. With no prospect of unemployment in the days ahead, they stared starvation in the face. Under these circumstances, the village they left behind beckoned as a refuge, a place where their families and social networks could provide a modicum of sustenance. Despite a law that protects migrant workers' rights and despite a decade-long institution of a universal portable security number called Aadhaar, state entitlements, meager as they are, remain tied for the most part to rural residents. Of these, subsidized food grains are the most important, but in some rural districts, so also are employment guarantee programs that provide minimum wages. Most pressingly, returning to the village meant avoiding the monetary drain of paying rent and purchasing food and other essentials in the city when earnings had stopped. Migrant workers keenly felt the irony of having to ask their rural families for money to return home. Until now, they had been the providers of cash. Their remittances funded the rebuilding of a house, the deepening of a well, the wedding of a daughter. During the festive seasons of Diwali or Eid, male migrants visited their villages laden with gifts, a new sari for a mother, a mobile phone for a brother, toys for children. They brought city fare with them and were looked up to as well-traveled sophisticates. Now there was the ignominy of returning empty-handed and defeated. As a grim-faced man standing in a serpentine line to get a polythene packet of food from a charity organization remarked, "Roti nahi, izzat chali gayi." We have lost not just bread, but we've lost our honor. For the workers who kept one foot in the city and the other in the countryside, there's perhaps no real home. Treated as interlopers in the cities where they work, they're reminded at every turn that they're there on sufferance. Their bastis under the ever-present threat of demolition, their regional identities used to disparage and discriminate against them. They label Bihari, Bhaiya, ethnic labels which are used as pejoratives, as people who are meant to be outsiders. Even after living in the city for decades, their claim to urban citizenship, the right to vote, entitlements to subsidized rations, education, and healthcare remains tenuous. On the other hand, the agrarian economy has no room for them, and the traditional anchor of family, caste, and village is not enough to keep bodies and souls together. Yet, faced with the prospect of dying, migrants return to the village so that at least they can console themselves that they will be cremated or buried by their kin in the ritually prescribed manner. A good death is by no means a trivial consideration. So, out of place in the city, out of work in the country, many migrant laborers live with displacement as a permanent condition. How much time do I have, Anjali?
JD, probably like 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. So, what's truly remarkable in some ways is that despite the widely reported and vivid evidence of hardship and suffering among laid off workers, better off sections of society neither sought to help them nor pressured the state to provide aid. Several NGOs and charitable organizations and individuals have stepped in and continue to do so with cooked food and provisions and medicines and medical aid, but their capacity falls far short of the scale of support required. Even emergency aid has been and continues to be inadequate, let alone the more durable resources needed to keep households going. At a time when the rhetoric of a united India has been raised to fever pitch by the Hindu nationalist government and its supporters, this callousness towards fellow citizens appears all the more appalling. And yet, callousness doesn't quite capture the essence of the phenomenon. Concern for the fate of less fortunate others is against the rules of the starkly divided landscape where elite privilege is predicated upon continued exploitation. The Indian middle classes and upper classes base their very existence on the labor of the working class while keeping them invisible and at a distance. Domestic workers, for example, perform chores within the intimate confines of small apartments in urban India where there can be little spatial distance. Yet, through a variety of practices that discipline the worker's body, where she can sit, whether she can use the bathroom or enter the kitchen, practices that delimit what she can do. She can't drink from the or eat from the same dishes. She can't speak to her employer as an equal. The middle class routinely marks out and maintains social distance. To the middle class, the working class is essential for the smooth running of the household and a source of risk that must be managed. What explains this dualism? I think the answer lies in the centrality of Indian caste ideology, ingrained into the habitus of every upper caste Indian, and this includes not only Hindus, but Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and followers of other religions, is the notion of pollution. Within the caste system, pollution is closely tied to bodily substances, hair, saliva, excreta, menstrual blood, and the dead body. Those who deal with polluting substances are by association deemed to be polluted and therefore dangerous since they can pollute others. Thus, the very people who earn a living from cleaning upper caste homes and from washing the bodies of upper caste children and the elderly, workers who remove the dirty products of upper caste bodies are themselves rendered dirty and polluting. Their labor is needed, yet their dangerous bodies must be distanced from upper caste ones. They're abject. Their proximity provokes revulsion and rejection. Domestic workers' bodies form the constitutive other against which the upper caste middle class understands itself. Social distancing is second nature to them. So, this cultural imagination of workers as productive labor within polluting bodies, as a danger and yet still a necessity that must therefore be managed, is complicated by India's large population. For the middle class, there are just too many poor people. Their presence is a drag on the path of economic progress. Ignoring the entire question of the enduring social and economic inequalities that make their lives possible. The fact that the top 10% of the Indian population holds 77% of total national wealth, and that inequalities in income and wealth have been increasingly rapidly increasing since the 1990s, when policies of economic liberalization were adopted. None of this matters. The middle class blames the poor for their poverty and for the nation's failure to become an economic superpower. In the middle class imaginary, the death or disappearance of a few million of this vast reserve of surplus labor would not be mourned. They have already been deemed lesser beings. That's why people can watch without horror the news video of a toddler playing with his mother's sari as she lies unattended on a railway platform.
Someone who enjoys thinking.
Not knowing that his mother's dead and that she died on a long trek home. Perceived as a dehumanized multitude, these bodies are of little value. And if the virus claims them, there are plenty more where they came from. The lockdown and the pandemic are what Veena Das calls critical events, cataclysmic moments in collective life that lay bare the structures of everyday life. They have brought to the surface the steely indifference of the state and elites to the fate of working classes, and indifference that at quote normal times lay concealed behind the brisk transactions between employers and workers. By shattering this public secret, COVID-19 may precipitate a crisis of legitimation as desperate workers rise in anger and dismay. And if that change in the world is to occur, it's likely to begin at home, or rather it's likely to begin with the idea of home, a place of security and comfort, a hope that's been denied to countless Indians. Next slide, please. I began my career as a sociologist living the highlands of the Narmada Valley in central India in 1990 in a village of Bhilala Adivasis who were fighting against being displaced by a large dam. Next slide. The dam was built and people were forced to move from their land and forests right where they live by the river. Next slide. But a generation later, there's little difference between those who were forcibly evicted and their kin in neighboring villages. Next slide. Those who live on by the river spend 9 months of the year laboring on construction sites and agricultural fields hundreds of kilometers away. Next slide. The land that they own can no longer sustain them. The forests have shrunk. The river is a dead reservoir. And their ideas of the good life are no longer contained by the village. They seek the bustle of the city, urban pleasures, the glitter of commodities. And even if they can't afford them, their allure is enticing. Writing about Rwandan refugees, Lisa Moltke said that people have always moved, whether through violence or desire. But how do we separate desire from violence that is not always physical, but also structural and epistemic? The push and pull factors that an earlier generation of demographers and geographers could use to categorically separate refugees from migrants blur when we think about domestic workers. Last slide, please. When we think about domestic workers, about men and women who can't make a living on the land, for whom the village is a backward, benighted place, and the city beckons as the only beacon of hope. As sociologists, what do we do with our everyday categories of the rural and the urban when the people who inhabit them don't feel they belong to either? With environmental risk and uncertainty likely to only grow as pandemics and climate change play havoc with already precarious lives of dealing with continuous environmental deterioration, economic policies that increase inequalities, migrant futures cast into doubt our disciplinary moorings. What new compass shall we navigate by? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amita. That was wonderful. I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Durr, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Amita. It is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Gökçe Günel, who is an assistant professor in anthropology at Rice University. Her latest book, which is entitled Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change, and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi, was published by Duke in 2019 and focuses on the construction of renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the United Arab Emirates, more specifically concentrating on the Masdar City project. Currently, she is at work on a second book project provisionally entitled Energy Accumulation, and I believe she'll speak about that second project today. I want to add an aside, which is that Gökçe first told me about her second project at Brandeis University in the fall of 2019, and I have been eagerly looking for an excuse to hear her speak more about that project. Finally, I want to say that Gökçe has been in collaboration with Saiba Varma and Chika Watanabe, developing a project entitled Patchwork Ethnography, which is a project on ethnographic methods which seeks to draw attention to how researchers' lives affect the processes of anthropological knowledge production. This is also a project that I follow closely on social media. Its first publication, which was entitled A Manifesto for Patchwork Ethnography, was the most read online piece in cultural anthropology in 2020. So it is with that I hand the floor over to Gökçe Günel with great pleasure.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to share my slides and start giving you a sense of my second project. Okay, 1 second. So as Jennifer kindly explained, my first book, Spaceship in the Desert, concentrated on the construction of a futuristic eco-city in Abu Dhabi called Masdar City, which was infused with utopian ideals about the time after oil. And in that first project, I studied the emergence of new energy infrastructure in the Arabian Peninsula, examining how oil-rich economies prepare for a future with less oil. Today, I'm going to present some thoughts from my new project where I flip this question and ask how countries that suffer from electricity shortages satisfy urgent power demands and accordingly investigate the quick and provisional energy infrastructures they employ. So one emergent system that has drawn my attention is power ships, floating power plants that anchor at the harbor, plug into a national grid, and generate electricity with heavy fuel oil or natural gas. The Turkish company Karadeniz Holding, or Karpower as it's known to many of its customers, has become an increasingly popular producer of power ships in the past decade. A family-owned business, Karpower builds the ships on spec in various shipyards in Istanbul and leases them to places with high energy demands. So as of March 2018, the company owned 43 vessels. More than 20 of these were power ships, while others were service ships that delivered fuel or provided housing to crew in locations where accommodations were difficult. And Karpower labeled their project The Power of Friendship, presenting it as a campaign to bring quick and cheap electric power to those in need. Their barge Ayşegül Sultan anchored in the Tema fishing harbor in Ghana, producing power for the country's grid between December 2015 and September 2017, initiating the company's operations in Africa. The larger power ship Osman Han replaced Ayşegül Sultan in late 2017, almost doubling Karpower's production volume. And in an effort to switch its fuel source from heavy fuel oil to natural gas, which is a less expensive and more environmentally friendly fuel, Osman Han moved in late 2019 from Tema to Takoradi, a port much closer to the country's natural gas reservoirs. Power ships illustrate the shift from what power companies have called permanent power to temporary power, although this binary admittedly doesn't reflect the complexities of the transformation. So a 2014 article in Power, which is the go-to trade publication, that has been published in North America since 1882 asked, when temporary power supplies nearly a quarter of a grid's demand, is it still temporary power? How about when a project lasts 10 years? The article continued, calling power service temporary doesn't quite capture all of its distinguishing attributes. It's temporary rather than permanent, rented rather than owned, and mobile rather than fixed. It's also modular and easily scalable. Others from the industry have argued that temporary power stations are compelling due to their rapid installation and low upfront capital requirements. So in this talk, I'll make 3 brief points. First, I want to argue that temporary power structures such as power ships preserve the imagination of long-term development and linear progress in the places where they're put to use. At times, their producers understand them as liminal devices whose presence demarcates a phase of planning and incubation and whose eventual demise will engender a new era of modernization. In Ghana, for instance, the provisional status of the power ship denoted an ever-extending period of transitionality, soon to be followed by various kinds of renewable energy infrastructure. Decision makers in Ghana employed a range of technological models and business solutions to precipitate that emergent era. Second, I'd like to show how temporary power structures power producers were financially and politically invested in extending and prolonging this liminal period they've generated as far into the future as possible, suspending the arrival of that age beyond their obsolescence. So we can, one of the executives with the company, Car Power, for instance, reported on the initial phase of their operations in Ghana by saying, we can extend this 10-year deal by another 10 years. We can even sell electricity to neighboring countries through Ghana. And so despite ambiguities regarding how long the ship would stay, development goals for the period beyond the ship's existence remained intact. Third, I'd like to argue that the seemingly simple makeshift qualities of temporary power structures, such as a floating power plant that can sail from Istanbul to, let's say, Tema and start producing electricity quickly, were made possible thanks to thick and long-term geopolitical and geo-economic relations between Turkey and various parts of Africa. Turkish foreign investment in Africa has grown over the past decade, and Turkish investment in Ghana's energy sector follows services provided by Turkish Airlines, which has direct flights and cargo services from Istanbul to more than 50 cities across Africa. And since 2002, the Turkish government has also expanded its governmental presence in Africa and currently operates embassies in 44 countries. On a discursive level as well, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's anti-Western propaganda has found supporters across Africa. In addressing audiences, Erdogan falls back on Turkey's Ottoman roots, tells his listeners that the Ottomans never colonized Africa or enslaved its peoples, and criticizes the development strategies implemented by the IMF and the World Bank across the continent, overall seeking to propose an alternative to the West. And in doing so, he attempts what historian Ayşe Çavdar has labeled imperialism by anti-imperialists. So beyond enabling a belief in the possibility of advancing to clean energy use, power ships also invoke developmental trajectories through facilitating relationships between Turkey and Africa. Okay. So as I explained, power ships promised temporary power, and they differentiated themselves from competitors through their formal qualities, namely by being ships which can move from sites of production to sites of consumption, utilizing a seascape relatively independent of logistics networks. And unlike other systems of power generation, the construction of power ships was undertaken in a different environment than the one in which the floating plant will function. By centralizing production in shipyards in Istanbul, the company controlled its operations efficiently. So, and power ships did not require large pieces of land in the places where they were put to use, making the projects more desirable for leasing countries. Once they arrived at the harbor, the only supplement the power ship necessitated was these high-frequency cables you see in this image here that connected the ship to the nearest substation. And in the case of Tema, Ghana, for instance, this substation was 9 kilometers away. Finally, since their only connection to the land was through high-frequency cables, power ships seemed more tenuous than land-based plants, giving the appearance that the ship could leave anytime, especially if and when their presence in these leasing countries no longer made financial or political sense. As temporary and market-based systems, power ships did not offer teleological narratives about progress. For instance, historian Stephen Misher shows how Ghana's Akosombo Dam had produced different temporalities of an industrialized future that would transform the country's rural past and create new cities, factories, and infrastructures during the 50s and the 60s. In his inauguration ceremony, independent Ghana's first president and Pan-African statesman, Kwame Nkrumah, announced, for instance, "It is in the spirit of fruitful collaboration for a better world for all that I inaugurate the Volta River project. Let us dedicate it to Africa's progress and prosperity. Only in this way will Africa play its full part in the achievement of world peace and for the advancement of the happiness of mankind." Nkrumah was overthrown by a military coup a few months after this ceremony. And in the decades following the coup, inadequate rainfall and rising temperatures associated with climate change have negatively impacted the hydroelectric power station. And at a time when power demand has been increasing across the country, Ghana's hydroelectric power stations are no longer able to satisfy national electricity needs. The power ship's temporary presence in Ghana did not offer, as I said, any of these kinds of teleological narratives about progress or world peace or any kind of advancement, but they signified a prolonged period of liminality, a state of in-betweenness with particular temporal and spatial qualities, which could eventually lead to a renewable energy future. So while they rely on power ships, countries like Ghana could invest in renewables. Sarkan, the country director of Car Power in Ghana, for instance, told me, echoing a common opinion, seeing these temporary power systems as interim solutions that could enable Ghana to vault over to renewable energy infrastructures, such as rooftop solar panels and small-sized on-the-grid power stations, indicating their potentiality. And Sarkan's comment implied that temporary power has made some planning for the future possible. A mechanical engineer in his late 40s with a strong interest in nautical design, Fikri had collaborated with a small team to plan and build the initial floating power plants in 2008 and 2009. So I'll take you briefly to the shipyards in Istanbul now to give you a sense of how these projects come about. In March 2018, as we circuited the Sedef shipyard, which is the largest private shipyard in Turkey, situated among 40 other shipyards of various sizes in the Tuzla neighborhood of Istanbul, he told me about these first ships. Between 2000 and 2005, everyone was building ships here in Tuzla. There was such a boom that design units couldn't handle production, he recalled. But then the 2008 crisis hit, and the shipping industry still hasn't recovered from that shock. Car Power executives had seen the 2008 financial crisis as an opportunity and started purchasing large second-hand ships with low prices from around the world. And the company already had a wide variety of investments in the energy sector, which was a flourishing industry during the privatization of electricity markets in Turkey in the early 2000s. And in fact, Car Power had been the first country to export electricity from Turkey because they had started providing electricity to Iraq soon after the US occupation. This was initially through a land-based plant, but after the financial crisis and after the sort of the fall of ship prices, executives wondered if it would be possible to place their electricity production facilities on a ship that would be anchored at the Basra harbor in Iraq. So refurbishing low-priced ships as floating power plants would be a good solution for countries with affordable fuel, crumbling infrastructure, and coastal access to rivers or the ocean. If the countries where they worked stopped compensating them for their services, then the ships would simply leave and would not remain hostage to clients. The business plan would work especially well in places like Africa, they thought, where it was difficult to receive financing for seemingly permanent large-scale energy projects. So complete with tall and well-ordered exhaust stacks that gleamed from afar, power ships combined elements of thermal power plants and large ships. Bobbing in ports deeper than 5 meters, the ships looked sturdy, substantial, and functional. Fatma, who was a third-generation board member who usually represented the company's stakes abroad and in the media, emphasized to me in a Facebook message that power ships were not high technology. It's not rocket science, she said. Fatma had a degree in economics and philosophy from a college in upstate New York, and we had come to meet each other through a friend who studied with her there. So her maternal grandfather had started Karadeniz Holding in the late 1940s, and the company had done well over the years, but never before garnered the attention it was receiving today. Now, according to Fatma, power ships were basically comprised of multiple engines that burned heavy fuel oil or natural gas. And she reiterated that this was old technology, which has not changed much for the past 100 years. Rather than building these power stations on land, Car Power chose to place them on used ships, rendering them safer, more mobile, and easier to manufacture. Here are a few more images from the, another image from the shipyard here. And power ships postponed the ideals of progress to an era that would commence upon their departure, and temporary energy infrastructure such as power ships generated electricity for the grid on a day-to-day basis and pragmatically attended to routine customer demand until they would eventually be replaced by other energy systems. So Salih, a Turkish ship engineer in Ghana, defined temporary power infrastructure as short-lived items. According to him, manufacturers specified a lifespan for what he called short-lived items. In terms of time, 1,000, for example, or usage, 100,000 miles, for example, Salih added. He believed that hydrogen energy would eventually satisfy global energy demand and hoped that it would also supply Ghana's needs in an abstract future beyond the power ships. And as an employee of a thermal power plant, Salih understood temporary power infrastructure as a stopgap solution, which had to be substituted. As businesses operating according to market logic, temporary power producers were financially and politically invested in extending this in-between period as far into the future as possible, suspending the arrival of an era beyond their obsolescence. And in Ghana, the ship had helped alleviate the persistent electric power outages that Ghanaians have been experiencing, christened Dumsor, meaning off and on. And during the final Dumsor episode between 2012 and 2015, power for industries and homes would be out for 24 hours to be turned back on for only 12 hours. Forced to diversify the country's energy portfolio, Ghanaian decision makers initially imported diesel generators and then switched over to power stations operated by heavy fuel oil, a resource much less expensive than diesel, and eventually leasing a power ship. In explaining their success in averting Dumsor, Kartal, a board member of Car Power, told me how discussions on energy tend to be fixated on the future, proposing solutions for forthcoming problems associated with climate change and impending energy scarcity, rather than focusing on significant issues that impact many people around the world in the present. For him, the crucial question was how we could turn the lights on today. What now, he concluded in English. And as we spoke, Kartal played with his plain silver bracelet with a stamped inscription, and the inscription said in capital letters, "Electric Man." It's important to note how, even when it was no longer necessary for Ghana's energy supply, the power ship did not leave, demonstrating that long-term political and financial and contractual relations at times outstripped practical necessities. Representatives of the Energy Commission and Electricity Company of Ghana and Gridco emphasized how the government had limited bargaining power when the power ship first arrived, as they were navigating an electricity crisis, and therefore had agreed to high prices, but could perhaps renegotiate in the later years of the power ship's operation. Beyond using emergency power from the floating power plant, the Electricity Company of Ghana signed 43 power purchase agreements with different vendors during Dumsor, altering the energy production portfolio of Ghana significantly for the years to come. Independent power producers from countries such as China and the UAE began generating electricity, mainly in power stations in Tema and Takoradi. He oversolved the problem, one energy professional who had been a junior member of a team at the Energy Commission, which is a regulator body, reflected back on the crisis. In 2020, 5 years after the end of Dumsor, Ghana suffered now from an excess of electricity on its grid. So in addition to enabling a belief in leapfrogging to clean energy, power ships brought forth ideas of progress through facilitating relationships between Turkey and Africa. Differently from their competitors, power ship operators attempted to construct a sense of familiarity with the countries where they worked, as evidenced by their slogan, "The Power of Friendship." Named after family members, the ships not only solidified the kinship network that gave rise to their production, but also were explicitly presented as visitors to leasing countries. These corporate strategies were supplemented by the ways in which the company's employees approached their counterparts. For instance, Serkan, the country director of Car Power I referred to earlier, told me that Turkey shares many customs with Ghana, such as common marriage rituals. Just like us, Ghanaian young men have to ask for their girlfriend's hands by paying a visit to the family, he described. Shared rituals assisted in the construction of familiarity. This emphasis on shared customs was a metonym for the possibility of shaping common developmental trajectories for Turkey and Ghana. A Ghanaian businessman explained that he enjoyed working with companies such as Car Power for precisely this reason. Their employees did not position their countries to be better than Ghana, but rather focused on the common problems they've experienced on the path toward development. They're not patronizing or condescending like American or French companies, he concluded. Given this emphasis on trust and familiarity, Car Power executives defined themselves as solution partners who were in collaboration with the countries where they worked, aspiring to solve shared problems rather than become evasive providers of temporary energy structures who could leave anytime. Despite the seemingly elusive nature of the ships, Car Power's operations in Ghana demanded longer-term multi-scalar relations, including those that happen at the level of the nation state, cultivated constantly by company executives. In other words, the simple makeshift qualities of provisional power, in this case the power ship, was made possible thanks to long-term geopolitical connections between Turkey and Africa. For instance, during his official address in the Dakar International Conference Center in March 2018, Erdogan emphasized, depleting Africa's resources and adopting a modern colonial system is not our style. As I found in interviews between 2016 and 2020, many in the business community in Turkey debated whether this populist propaganda is actually useful for business and attempted to track the investments Erdogan's diplomatic visits might have fostered. Still, many members of the business community claim that diplomatic trips to Africa advance a sense of commitment, strengthening the notion that all Turkish companies could become such solution partners. Through such populist propaganda, Turkish exports were at the same time harnessed to distinct ethical regimes and political projects. These distinct ethical and political regimes, as exemplified by the Turkish business people's willingness to suffer together with African countries, their ability to showcase Turkey as a model for overcoming certain developmental problems, and their seeming desire to propose an alternative to companies from the West, allowed populist leaders such as Erdogan to claim an imperial legacy both domestically in Turkey and outside the country in Africa. For instance, during conversations with Mauritanian businessmen who were interested in doing business with Turkish companies, I heard over and over that Erdogan would win national elections in Mauritania if he wished to become the president there. A Turkish executive from a company with successful businesses all over Africa told me over coffee how they were like monkeys performing for the government and showcasing Turkey's business capacity. Turkish investment in Africa not only relied on such non-imperialist imperialism, but also sustained and augmented it. Such Turkish exports to Africa also added to Erdogan's popularity back home in Turkey. During diplomatic trips, Turkish foreign policy in Africa found its footing. And I met Kartal, one of the senior board members from Car Power I referred to earlier, in one such trip in Senegal in February 2018, and had time to have stimulating conversations with him over lunches and dinners during 4 intensive days. The Foreign Economic Relations Board of Turkey had organized this trip, and the press relations team had invited me to join the delegation that comprised of about 120 businessmen and some journalists. And our presence in the Dakar International Conference Center that I referred to earlier was significant because Turkish construction companies had developed this building. And Turkish construction companies wished to be in the running for more contracts, seeking to compete with French and Chinese counterparts. Like these construction companies, power producers such as Car Power and AXA, which operate broadly across Africa, were poster children of Turkey's expansion, acting as what some called a soft power mechanism employed to exert Turkish foreign policy there. Beyond partaking in such national strategies, joining diplomatic trips was at times commercially valuable for particular representatives of Turkish businesses such as Kartal. When two representatives from the Senegalese government approached him outside this large hall where Erdogan was scheduled to address government and business representatives, Kartal kindly asked me to stay with him and listen to their negotiation, as this would help me learn how they conducted their business. The two Senegalese men had heard good things about the power ships from their contacts in Ghana, and they knew that the ships were now in use in Gambia and Sierra Leone as well. When a construction company representative from the Turkish delegation told them that Kartal was there in the conference venue and mentioned that he could arrange a meeting, they became very interested. They did not know much about power, but they knew that the power ships were now a popular trend. Without wasting too much time on pleasantries, the two Senegalese representatives told us that they'd been told Kartal that they'd been talking to some international companies who could provide electricity to Senegal. These unnamed companies had made an offer for 11 cents per kilowatt hour, so the Senegalese representative asked if Kartal's company would be able to propose a better bid. But Kartal refrained from engaging with the representatives in their own terms. Rather than talking about price, let's talk about delivery times, he said. Our ships can be here in 2 weeks. Can the other company give you electricity in such a short time? He was planning on leasing Ayşegül Sultan, the ship that used to power Ghana's grid and that now had been replaced with a larger Osman Han, to Senegal. When the man left, he turned to me and said, wouldn't it be very convenient if we didn't have to move Ayşegül Sultan all the way back to Istanbul, and if we could use it in Dakar instead? The floating power plants were enmeshed in complex relations, which not only relied on and reproduced geopolitical relations between Turkey and Africa, but also required various staff and executives to make decades-long commitments, sacrifice personal schedules, and have the capacity to move swiftly between geographies, showing up here and there at once. Although Kartal was scheduled to return to Istanbul with Erdogan's business delegation that evening, he asked for his suitcase to be retrieved from the plane and stayed in Dakar for a second, more intensive conversation with the Senegalese government scheduled for the next afternoon. He always took a photograph of his suitcase with his iPhone because he usually found himself in this situation where he had to ask flight attendants to remove his luggage from the plane for an urgent meeting. His plans changed constantly. In cultivating closer and stronger relations with his clients, Kartal was always willing to rework his schedule, and he believed that this flexibility gave him the upper hand in conducting business in Africa. It's time for me to buy my own plane so that I don't deal with this kind of thing, he said. But once I buy a plane, I'll also have to hire bodyguards. The nature of the business will completely transform. Several days later, he sent me a WhatsApp message to say that his conversation with the Senegalese authorities had gone well. There was a good chance they would lease 2 ships to them rather than 1. And in late 2019, Ayşegül Sultan finally started generating electricity in Senegal. And so even at a time of electricity excess, the power ship in Ghana did not leave, evidencing how the profit-making needs of independent power producers and the contractual relations between various decision makers impacted the Ghanaian grid. An examination of these relations across scales illustrates how the tenuous and makeshift qualities of temporary power might obfuscate the social and political relations that occur over long periods of time, catalyzing the seascape of power. Thank you.
I want to thank both of our speakers so much for what were just super generative presentations. And I now want to open the floor to questions and conversation. Just as a quick reminder, you can either raise your hand in the reactions function, or also happily you can chat me a question. So if there are questions, now is the time. And I think with that, I will turn the floor over to my co-host, Anjali, to open our conversation.
Thank you, both of you, for such generative conversations. And I was thinking, Gökçe and Amita, about the images that you ended with, or almost ended with, yours with a carry-on bag, and then Amita, the image that we lingered on the most, the toothbrush, the toothpaste, and the medicine, and the kind of labor segmentation that is in both of those images. So the question I have for both of you, and Gökçe, this might require perhaps something that you're not thinking about, but maybe will have to, is what is happening to the sign of the migrant within the kinds of histories of the pandemic that we are seeing now. So Amita, you talked a lot about dependency and where do you go home, where do you return from? But the migrant communities are also intra and extra national within South Asia, right? From Bangladesh, Nepal, and not so much from Sri Lanka or Pakistan, obviously. So what is happening to what it is that we understand by migrant labor in this sort of cesspool of return and people who are staying, etc. And I think, Gökçe, the same question for you. I mean, this interesting conversation that you're setting up between Turkey and Ghana and these very complicated histories of independence and interdependence. What will happen now, given the rise of vaccine capitalism, which is really determining who gets to travel, who gets to go where, even within South-South, right? So our lovely fascist Narendra Modi, who thought India was the pharmacy of the world and gave the vaccine away to other countries, the global South, etc. So I'm really curious to see what is happening with the terms that are framing your conversation. And Amita, you expressed it in your talk, but I want to hear more about the geopolitics of the idea of the migrant. So whatever you fancy, but thank you very much for your wisdom.
Should I go first?
Yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah. So this book was on my to-read list for a long time, but I finally read it last month. A book by Amita Bhaviskar called Gun Island. And it was just so appropriate for this moment because it was about the connections that climate change has, rather the currents of crises and migration that climate change has let loose around the world. And it begins with the wonderful estuarine system called the Sundarbans, which is where the river Ganga or Ganges flows into the Bay of Bengal and joins the Indian Ocean, an area which has seen enormous invasion because of the rising sea levels, but also tremendous devastation because the mangrove forests, which cover most of that area, have been destroyed by a number of different kinds of projects, including power projects of the kind that Gökçe was talking about, but also because of the new kinds of extreme events that climate change throws forth, right? The cyclones, the hurricanes, and so on. And so there's been this tremendous dispersal of people from Bengal in India, as well as Bangladesh, where the bulk of the Sundarbans geography is concentrated across the world. And Ghosh goes from Bengal and Bangladesh to Venice, a city that's also sinking because of rising water levels, a city with its own extraordinary maritime links of trade, globalization, but several hundred years ago. So I think the kind of links that he draws in that book, which are links across temporalities and across geographies, are an important reminder about the way in which new crises of the pandemic, of climate change, no longer recognize borders, if they ever did, but now even more so, given that time-space compression, that definition that David Harvey gave for globalization is now very much a fact. And the question then becomes, what politics of recognition that can in some way come to terms with these fluid borders, people moving, viruses moving, goods and commodities moving, Turkish ships anchored in the sea near outside Dakar or somewhere else. But how do we make sure that our social, economic, political institutions, our modes of thinking and acting are able to deal with this fluidity, whether internationally or nationally? I'm not sure we have any, we're always sort of chasing after the fact. Our passport regimes, our borders, these are in many ways 19th century artifacts. that are constantly being swept aside by what we call informality, illegality, all those people and things that move, even though officially they're not supposed to. So, how does one then aim for greater recognition, greater legitimacy, in order that we are able to recast these, these boundaries in ways which are more flexible, which recognize the contingencies that rule our lives more than ever?
Yeah, Amita, thank you so much for that. I think that's a very thoughtful response, and I'll just briefly add to your response by saying that when I look at this, for instance, the development of this kind of this new kind of energy infrastructure, I'm seeing how it benefits from, in its emergence, it benefits from the intersection of three different crises, which is the 2008 financial crisis, the Iraq War, and climate change. And now with the pandemic, I haven't done any field work about this, but as I'm following the media, I'm seeing that the technology is becoming more popular because so many of the construction projects for permanent land-based plants in these in various countries have been stopped, and so having a sort of a ship come generator serve your power grid becomes sort of like a useful sort of mechanism. In the process, I think Amita's question is really helpful in thinking about this context where, okay, so if this is the kind of empirical reality we're facing, what kind of governmental and what kind of political regime do we need in order to actually think about this in a critical way, in a way that actually allows for some kind of justice to emerge alongside these kinds of technologies. So I'm not sure exactly how to generate that, but when I look at the infrastructure, I'm also sort of trying to see, okay, so who are the people who have to operate this infrastructure and who have to actually shift their lives in order to make these projects work according to their sort of initial intentions. And one of the things I was quite curious about, for instance, is if you go back to sort of the question of the migrant, was how the emergence of a technology like power ships and its proliferation across the world transformed ship engineers, who are people who just like go on short-term, or maybe like 6 month, let's say, voyages on mostly bulk carriers around the world or on oil tankers, all of a sudden have been transformed into power plant workers who now have, let's say, what they could call homes in these countries, like in the countries where they work. For instance, one of the engineers I met initially when I first started doing research on this was the engineer who was in charge of the ship, the first ship in Iraq, and who had then moved from Iraq to Ghana. And this person, through the emergence of this kind of infrastructure, all of a sudden became not a ship worker anymore, but a migrant to these countries who keeps going back and forth initially between Iraq and Turkey, and then now between Ghana and Turkey. And now the last time I spoke to him, his family had moved to Ghana and was basically becoming sort of based there as a figure in the energy industry there. And so I think it's also kind of interesting to sort of see what role labor plays in producing different regimes of migration. So in the case that I'm looking at, it's sort of a middle class labor of the engineers, and in Amita's case, I think we saw the sort of how working class labor by the sort of domestic workers generates a different kind of migration regime with different kinds of connections.
I think the next question we have is from Ida Tarek.
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you. I have a more specific question to Gökçe, but I think it can go back to this like question of justice again. I was wondering if it is possible to know what kind of projects these power ships are providing power, providing energy to in Ghana or Senegal. I think my question is if it is possible to follow the energy grid, the power grid, because like given how like the power ships are not geared towards providing energy in the long term, so I was wondering if it is designed in a way to support specific projects, maybe construction projects or like infrastructural projects in where they land. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question because there are power structures like that that actually, I mean, there's a company famous, I mean, the well-known company called Agrarian, for instance, that does that kind of work where they build a power structure that just specifically serves a construction project or serves a the development of a port or something, a big project like that. In this case, no, this is not the case. So this is in all of the power ships that I've visited or that I've, so for instance, specifically, I'm looking at the one in Ghana and the one in Ghana or the one in Senegal as well. They serve the national grid, which means that the electricity they provide gets plugged in like any other power producer in the country. So it's the grid that uses is not any different from, let's say, the grid that Akosombo Dam uses in Ghana, which means that it's power on the grid, and so it also suffers from the contingencies of all the sort of different, let's say, breakdowns on the grid. So it doesn't necessarily directly provide electricity to a certain group of people or a certain project. Yeah, thank you, though. That's helpful to explain the specificity of that.
I also wanted to use my position as host to interject and ask a question. But I now see Janed's had it, so I'm going to ask a very short question, which is that, and my question is for Gökçe. I'm trying to think about the story that you're telling in conversation with a more conventional story about the construction of large dams on the African continent, especially funded by China. And so I was interested in hearing you talk about the relationship of what is on the one hand a really conventional form of energy construction, on the other hand something that we're not used to thinking about, but also, you know, both Turkey and China are positioning themselves as the non-imperialist powers. And I imagine that potentially there is also a kind of developmental relationship between the two of them. So anything you could say about that would be much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, there is a lot of China envy amongst the Turkish businessmen I meet because they believe that Turkey gets sort of bound up in like OECD protocols. Turkey cannot do barter. Turkey cannot go for like different kinds of mixed economic models, whereas the Chinese, from the perspective of the Turkish businessman, the Chinese have a very different range of financial tools at their disposal that they can use once they're in sort of various African countries, and of course that I think that comment translates into a different kind of, again, if you think about geopolitical relations, it translates into a sort of Turkey's very minor role in these let's say African markets in comparison to China's very major role. So in the specific context of Ghana, the Chinese the Chinese power plant, the Chinese thermal power plant is the largest thermal plant operating right now. And it's a thermal plant that was actually used in China between 1991 and 2008, I believe, and was brought from China to now sort of produce electricity for the Ghanaian grid. But I guess if I come back to sort of the point from the talk, which is about sort of, you know, how there's an insistence on the possibility of a future beyond sort of thermal power, which is going to appear in the shape of, let's say, solar, and mostly solar, I guess, is the main technology in Ghana that's being discussed. The Chinese producers are the ones who are actually building solar panels. And in order to be able to build a solar power plant or any kind of power plant in Ghana, you first have to get approval from the government, approving that you can build it. Because if the government doesn't buy your electricity, then there's no other, no one else can buy it, right? So if you don't have that approval, you go into build the construction of a power plant with a much higher risk, because you might build it and then somehow you might not have a customer to buy it. But the Chinese producers of solar panels and solar power plants decided that this was too bureaucratic for them. So they just went ahead and built the power plant. And of course, at the time, by the end of the construction project, when the power plant was now in operation, the government did come to them, and the electricity company of Ghana did come to them and did start buying their electricity. So this story was told to me various times by different kinds of people in the electricity industry in Ghana, also amongst us, also by Turkish power producers, to sort of say, this is the kind of thing that only China can do. This is because China has access to financing that's very sort of fluid, and also China has access to technological sort of, they build the solar power plants, solar panels in China, so it's not as expensive for them to bring it and build it there, etc., etc. So there is, let's say, competition, but I think it wouldn't be fair to say that there is really competition between the sort of, let's say, the Turkish businesses and the Chinese businesses there. But I think the question then becomes, how do we analytically sort of think about these transformations? And I think maybe one way of approaching them is not necessarily about who gets to do what, but more about sort of how the power infrastructure now is changing ownership. So the power infrastructure that's initially owned, let's say, through the 20th century, owned by the Ghanaian state, is now is changing in nature, and many of the power systems are owned by independent power producers, regardless of where they're coming from, which changes the sort of the electricity rates in the country, which changes the sort of the meaning of the grid in the country as something that's not necessarily something to rely on, but rather as something to endure, because the quality of the infrastructure is changing as well as it becomes privatized.
I will now turn the floor over to Junaid for our final question.
Thank you, both of you, for your wonderful talks. My question is for Amita, and it's about a subtext in the talk that I wanted you to clarify more on, which was the way in which the urban middle class deals with the urban poor, dealt with the urban poor initially was through this lens of moral economy, or that's how I read the way you were describing. And that, of course, falls apart, and probably it's also arguable in your own rendering whether that model ever even worked. But then that arc shifted to a possibility that the workers may rise up in anger. And I wanted to ask you about that. This rising up in anger, do you think that there is a possibility of a revolutionary transformation in this anger? Or maybe more realistically, is it maybe they'll be dragooned into acts of, mobilized into ethnic and caste violence? So I just wanted some more clarification on that.
Thank you for that question. It's a very thoughtful one. By the way, congratulations on your new book, Outcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
And well, I wanted to, I'd rather say that the idiom of moral economy is actually the idiom that conceals the quite, matter-of-fact exploitative relations that exist. And yet it's a relationship of mutual dependence, where the idiom of calling a domestic worker, she's like one of the family. But of course, she's not like one of the family. These are ways of making it work by making these intimate relationships manageable. And I think what the lockdown showed was, in fact, that moral economy mattered hardly at all. For the most part, people just refused to live up to whatever sense of obligation you might have thought they would have as quote unquote benevolent employers. So throughout crises of other kinds with the present government, be it the fact that they demonetized currency in a way that badly hit the informal sector, which primarily depended on cash transactions, be it other kinds of insane steps that they've taken. There's always been this sense among left progressive folks that surely now people will rise up. How can they keep taking this shit day after day and not even vote against the government? I mean, let alone protest in other wider kinds of ways in terms of more radical transformations. You're quite right. There are a lot of the anger and the resentment has been effectively captured by Hindu nationalist forces by harnessing it towards hate politics, towards Muslims, towards those who eat beef, towards anybody who can, towards women who are not following the norms of caste and subcaste and not obeying their parents and elder brothers and all the rest of it. So there is a significant amount of energy that's been captured effectively by the BJP. And I think, though I would like to believe that the present crisis, horrible and awful as it has been, in some way, if we are to take the elections that just happened, not only the state elections, but also the municipal elections, which have happened in UP, the most, as you know, populous state, the one which has basically a Hindu thug as chief minister. This is, I think those election results tell us that there is a sense now of no more. I mean, no more can we expect the government at the center and its counterparts at the state level to, to deliver anything that they promised. Mind you, it actually is consistent with the long-standing cynicism that people have about governments. People often say, Sarkar to aise hi hai. This governments are like this. Don't expect anything more. But to the extent that people take the trouble to vote, to the extent that they take trouble to, join political parties and all kinds of different organizations, I think we see something of that anger and discontent express itself. I don't see it as leading to anything particularly drastic because, as you know, we're so hopelessly out of other kinds of visions and positive choices at the moment. But just to get this particular set of people and the horrendous ways in which they've accelerated the crises that are always sort of hovering around people's lives, I think that's a step forward for now, and let's hope for longer as well.
Thank you.
So I think with that, we'll conclude. I wanted to thank everybody for coming today, and especially to Gökçe and to Amita for some very important presentations. I also wanted to mention, and I think Anjali can give you more details, that the Center for South Asian Studies is soon featuring an event in which Jagged will discuss his recent book.
Yes, with Sheetal Chabria, who's also writing about colonial Bombay in a different tenor. So I hope you will join us for us. I know this is a very difficult time, and everyone is Zoom exhausted. So we are grateful for the folks who showed up. And there are a lot of folks who are listening in other venues who are not here. So we hope to see many of you back again. Be safe and Jai Bhim.
Take care.